and welcome to the Locala Talking Sense sensory training package. Please watch every one of the first 4 videos which explain different types of sensory need and how to help. You may then choose one of the follow-on videos which cover topics such as sleep, toileting needs and eating and meal times. This is part 2.
Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Talking Sense, which is all about the 5 senses. So the senses that we're going to particularly focus on in this presentation are the touch sense, and we're going to be thinking about when children over and under respond to touch and the problems that this might cause, and also how we can help. We're going to be thinking about the sense of sight and also children who can over and under respond in this sense as well, and what we can do to support them. The last sense we're going to be thinking about in detail is the hearing sense, and we'll be thinking about the difficulties that children can have when they under and over respond to sound, and we'll also think about things that we can do to help them. So just to recap, the senses are special organs that tell us about either what's happening inside our body or what's happening in the world around us. The 5 senses are touch, eyesight, the sense of hearing, the sense of taste and the sense of smell. So in this presentation, like we've just said, the ones we're going to be really focusing on are touch, sight and hearing, but we will be talking a bit more in detail about difficulties with taste and smell in the units on eating and meal times and the unit on toileting. So the first sense that we're going to talk about in a little bit more depth is our sense of touch. So the sense of touch has lots of different receptors, lots of touch receptors in the skin. So some of these are located on the surface of the skin, just under the surface, quite deep in the skin. And there's different kinds of receptors that pick up different kinds of touch messages. So the sort of messages that they might pick up are things like tickle, the sense of pain, the sense of vibrations also picked up by some of these sensors. And we also feel light touch, so say if something's just brushing past our skin. But if you look on this diagram here, you can see that we've also got a lot deeper in the skin. We've got some sensors and they pick up deep and firm pressure. So obviously the skin would have to be pressed quite firmly before those sensors would be activated. But the key point I really want everybody to think about on this slide is, as you can see on this picture, this just shows a tiny little cross section of skin from the tiniest tip of our finger. And if you can see in that little tiny bit just how many touch sensors there are. So this is showing 5 different sensors, but you can see there's more than one of each one, and that's on that tiny little bit of skin. So if you imagine all the skin on your whole body and just think about how many sensors there are, it just shows, the sense of touch is a massive system, and it's not surprising that for a lot of children this is something that they have difficulty with. So touch discrimination is basically what happens when all of these messages are sent to the brain, and the brain pulls it all together so that it can make sense of all this information, and we can use it in our daily lives. So the things it helps us to do are tell the difference between different kinds of textures, so we can feel if something feels rough, if it feels smooth, if it feels soft, etc, etc. Sometimes we can recognize things just by feeling them. We don't need to actually look at them. We can tell where on our body something's touching us, where we've been tapped, and if we've got a pain, we can tell exactly where that is, and we can tell somebody about it. It also helps us to do things that we wouldn't even think about, like if we're holding something, it helps us to keep a firm grip on things, and it also helps us to manipulate things that we can't see. So functionally, this means that we can do things like we can find something in a pocket or bag without needing to look. If you've got a pocket full of change, and this system's working well, you can just have a feel and you can find a pound coin and separate that from the other ones just by feeling it. You can also do things like fasten the top button so you can't see it, but you can just feel where it is, you can feel where the buttonhole is, you can line it up, and you can do it just by touch alone. Again, really importantly, we can tell somebody where it hurts. We can grade how much force we need to use with things, so we can handle things that are fragile or pets that are fragile, and we're not going to damage them. We know just exactly how much force to use. And also, very importantly, we can keep hold of a cup of tea or a cup of coffee without dropping it. We know exactly how to keep a firm grip on the things that we're holding. So our touch sense is also designed to help to keep us safe through something called the protective touch system. So this system is there to warn us about possible danger. So the thoughts of danger that it warns us about are things like a poisonous insect, or something that's poisonous brushing against or landing on our arm. So for example, if this beautiful scorpion here were to land on us, we'd need to know about it immediately so that we could do something about it. So it's usually triggered by sort of light touch, particularly unexpected light touch, which is exactly what would happen if something like a poisonous spider landed on your arm. And so once this system's been activated, obviously if I've got a scorpion on my arm, I can't just sit here looking at it thinking, oh, a scorpion, I need to do something about it really quickly to keep me safe. So this system triggers a massive, strong panic response. We get a big surge of adrenaline and it gets us all steeled up to deal with the threat and to do something about it. So the very important key point here is that for children who've got senses that have got muddled, everyday touch can trigger this extreme protection response. So quite often just light touch. So say, for example, somebody brushing past you can trigger this awful panic, very, very strong reaction. And a lot of children who are able to explain how these things feel can quite often say that things feel painful. So for example, I worked with a little boy, and when his dog brushed past him, the light hair of the dog brushing past him, he felt that the dog had bitten him because it felt so painful, just that everyday light touch. So this is a really important thing to remember, because it's really common for children to have difficulties with this overprotective, this protective touch being really over responsive and just working with just everyday things that are not actually a threat.
So what sort of behaviours might we see from children who under or over respond to touch? So children who under respond to touch quite often just don't notice the feel of things at all. So their clothing might be really twisted, their shoes might be too tight, um, the tongue could be pushed right inside the shoes, and they might not notice these things at all unless somebody else points it out to them. Again, they might not notice, if you just tap them on the back to get attention, they may well not register that, they may well not notice. Again, a lot of children who under respond to touch are often covered in bruises and scratches and that sort of thing, but they have literally no idea how that's happened or when, because they just didn't notice that sensation at the time. And again, as we've talked about, when we talked about touch discrimination, they're going to really struggle to find things just by feel. So they're going to need to tip everything out of their bag or out of their backpack in order to find something. And again, because they respond to temperature as well as touch, sometimes they might get into a bath that's too hot or again too cold and not notice. They might go outside in the winter without a coat on and just not register the temperature at all. And quite often children who under respond to touch really need to touch everything around them as well as looking at it. They might be running their hand along the wall, they might just need to fiddle with everything that's around them. They might want to touch other people's hair or clothes or jewellery, and they're just trying to get as much touch sensation as they can that way. So on the flip side, for the children who over respond to touch, again, something we're going to see a lot of is them getting angry and upset if other people accidentally brush past them. So it's that sudden light touch that's going to trigger that. Quite often we're going to see lots of difficulty tolerating and coping with different sorts of clothing, different fabrics. Labels in clothes are a really big one, and a lot of children have to have those taken out. And again, certain types of fabric are often harder to tolerate than others. So things that are rough, that have got quite a lot of texture, like denim, so jeans, and they're quite structured. They've got lots of bits on them. Really difficult for people to tolerate. Again, things like tight collars, stiff things like sort of blazer collars, ties around their neck, that sort of thing. Always really difficult. Again, self-care is really hard for children who over respond to touch. So they're going to really avoid things like having their hair washed or brushed or cut. They're probably going to find things like showering, bathing really difficult. Something that's massively problematic for a lot of children is having their nails cut, and it seems to be toenails that trigger a really strong response, but fingernails are often bad as well. And again, as we've said, they're really going to struggle with certain food textures. If they really over respond to touch, they're probably going to want either things that are really dry and crunchy, or things that are really soft, and they're going to avoid mixed textures. So a lot of children who over respond to touch will avoid hugs. They won't want to stand too close to other people, or if they do give hugs, it's always very much on their terms. They might not like touching certain textures. So examples here, things like sort of chalk, some microfiber materials, cotton wool, that kind of thing can be really hard for them to cope with. And again, they're going to avoid touching messy and sticky things. They're not going to really enjoy maybe things like painting, gluing, or eating sticky food. So they might either avoid it altogether, or they might need to wash their hands immediately after they've done that activity and cope with it that way.
We've talked a little bit about some of the difficulties children might have with touch if they over or under respond to it, but just think a little bit now about how we might be able to help. So thinking first of all about children who over respond to touch sensations, and I think we need to keep thinking back. The thing that triggers the really unpleasant panic response in touch is things being unexpected, and things being sort of a light touch. So if it's possible to use deep pressure rather than light touch, this makes it a lot easier. Children find this a lot easier to tolerate than light touch. So again, if you're having to do some hands-on support with people, hold them firmly. I know it's when you know that they don't like touch, it's sort of instinctive to try not to touch them, but actually deep firm touch can sometimes be helpful. And some children cope better, say, when dad's supporting them with self-care than when mum is, because dad maybe tends to hold them a little bit more firmly than mum does. So use firm pressure if they need some physical help. The other thing you can do as well is just pre-warn them so that it's not unexpected. They know when something's happening and they know how long it's going to last, and that can really help. Again, we will talk about this a little bit more. If you'd like to watch the self-care presentation, this goes into some of these strategies in more depth. So some children as well might need some deep pressure prep before tasks that they're going to find really difficult. So say if things like dressing or self-care is a real trigger for your child, if you can do some deep pressure activities beforehand, this might really help them to just sort of take the edge off that sensitivity. And on the video on the next slide, it will show you some strategies that you can use for deep pressure. So the other thing that can be really helpful as well, a lot of children who are sensitive, particularly if they're sensory avoiders, really need to feel in control when they're faced with difficult sensations. So even if you can give them a small bit of control over one aspect of the task, they can decide, when to do it, they can decide who helps, and they can decide, so if it's a self-care task, what products they want to use. These sorts of things can just make a little bit of a difference. And the other thing as well is that if you manage to keep anxiety levels reasonably low, quite often children do get used to sensation over time. So things that might be difficult now, if you carry on, and you manage to manage their anxiety, we should find that regular exposure while they're calm can just help to take the edge off things over time as their systems mature even more. So on the other side of the touch difficulties, children who under respond to sensation need lots and lots of opportunities for sensory play, where they're really having to use their discriminative touch skills. So again, the video on the next slide is going to show you some examples of things that you can do. But again, it's things like sensory bins where you've got different textures to feel, finding little things that are hidden in Play-Doh or other textures, things in a feely bag, or playing little games like which finger. So I'll just see the slide now and the next sense we're going to think about a little bit more is the sense of sight. So obviously it goes without saying, the receptors for the vision are our eyes. I think everybody is aware of that. But just to talk a little bit more about, we've got different cells in our eyeballs that do different things, that pick up different kinds of visual information. So there's got some of the cells will pick up information about light, some of them will pick up information about colour, and some of them will pick out information about movement. And our brain is really cleverly able to use our past experiences to put all of these things together, so it can make sense of the images that we're actually seeing and work out what it is that we're looking at. So the other thing that the brain does as well, which is very, very helpful, it's really good at processing the information into chunks or bundles so that we can process things a little bit faster. So we don't always need to look at everything to work out what something is. We can just look at little bits of it, and that gives us enough information to work things out. So for example, sometimes when we look at words, we don't need to look at every single letter in order to read the word. Our brain has already processed that for us, so we can do it a little bit faster. But I think the key thing to remember as well is for some children who've got sensory processing difficulties, their brain isn't able to do this. They haven't got access to those shortcuts. So they might need to look at absolutely every little piece of something in order to pull it together and to make sense of it. And that's one of the reasons sometimes why they might need longer to think about something or to work something out than somebody who doesn't have any sensory processing difficulties in this area. And I think one of the key points here is that what we see and what we think we see can sometimes vary depending on what we focus on. And this is really well illustrated in the video on the next slide, which is called the monkey business illusion.
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion.
So what sort of things might we see when children under or over respond to vision? So children who under respond to vision quite often don't notice things that are in their way. So parents will sometimes say it looks like they walk through people. They might just stand on toys and walk straight over things when they're trying to get something they can see across the room, and they don't visually scan where they're going a lot of the time. And because of this, out and about, you might find that they miss steps or not notice curves or changes in level. They might be quite prone to trip and fall over if you don't prompt them about things that are coming up and the need for them to look and to watch where they're stepping. And they're going to find it very hard to find things that are in plain sight, so they might not be able to find something that they're looking for that's just in front of them. They might not, again, for an adult, might not be able to spot a friend in a crowd or something that you need when shopping. Again, a child might be looking for something like their iPad or some food in the fridge, and it might be completely in front of them and they just can't see for looking. Again, a lot of the time, anybody who under-responds to vision can quite often struggle with reading, particularly keeping their place and working out where they are. So they might either skip lines, need to have their finger there, they might really just not want to read because they find it so difficult. Again, they're going to find anything that's sort of a visual activity, such as doing a jigsaw, they're going to find that really, really challenging. It's probably not going to be fun for them. It's probably not something they're going to want to do. And they find that they might need to look very closely or stare at things to make sense of them. So on the other flip side, children who over-respond to vision are going to notice far too much visual information, and they will notice all the small tiny details that normally get filtered out. So again, when we say fluff on the carpet here, we're talking tiny little specks of fluff some children will pick those out and they notice them and nobody else would see, that sort of thing. Again, they might notice all the texture in sort of paint, or they might notice just tiny little cracks in the glaze of their plate or their mug. Quite often a lot of toys have got tiny little numbers and letters and things printed on them, and they will find those and they will look at those. So again, if they're noticing that much detail just on just inside on a small item, just imagine how much detail they're going to notice if they're somewhere that's visually really busy, and how overwhelming that's going to be. So again, we quite often find that children who over-respond to vision are really bothered by light, and they really can't cope when it's bright or when it's sunny. So they might either be squinting, covering their eyes over, insisting on wearing a hat or sunglasses if that's the sort of thing that they can tolerate. And again, quite often it takes their eyes much longer to acclimatise. So if they're going from a dark room to somewhere that's bright, or from a bright room to somewhere that's dark, it really takes them a long time to get used to that. They can experience sort of flashing sensations, that kind of thing. So these are the sorts of things to look out for.
So again, we've talked about difficulties children might have if they over or under respond to vision. So on this slide, we're just going to think a little bit about ways that we might be able to help them. So for children who over respond, particularly if you've got somebody who really quite significantly over responds to vision, it might be useful to think about different accessories and things that you can use which just sort of reduce the amount that they're seeing. So again, something like a cap that's got a peak on it, or a hat with a large brim. It's just going to reduce information, sort of visual information from around their peripheral vision. Or again, some people might like things like wraparound sunglasses, because again it reduces some of the side vision that you can see, and it just reduces the amount of glare and the light that you're being exposed to as well. Some children and some people find the tinted dyslexia glasses really help. So people who get a lot of eye strain, or who maybe struggle to cope with artificial light in the classroom, these sorts of things can be really helpful as well. And again, it's just thinking, if you've got somebody who really does over respond to vision, think about decor at home. Try to keep things neutral. If you can, try and keep decor fairly plain. Avoid sort of really bold patterns or strong colours, because those are things that they'll find really difficult to tolerate. So particularly in their bedroom, make sure that they've got a space where it is really as plain and as low stimulus as it can be from a visual point of view. The other thing that can be really helpful as well is just organising belongings, because if there are things piled everywhere, again, it's going to be, from a visual point of view, it's going to be really distracting. It's going to be overwhelming. So if it's possible to get things put away in drawers, or even just to maybe have a sheet and cover things over if they're too much and it helps your child to concentrate, this can be really helpful. And again, for children who really do struggle with becoming very overwhelmed with too much information, they might need something like a dark den. So there's a picture there of a pop-up tent that's designed to be a dark space, but again, you don't need to have to buy anything expensive. You can just either get a big box from something like a washing machine and have a space that they can use there, or if you've got a table and you can throw a sheet or a rug over it and make a little dark space there, and just spending a little bit of time in there where they're not being overly stimulated with too much vision can just really help children to regroup and stop them from just getting completely overloaded. So on the other side of the coin, when you've got children who under respond to sensation, they're going to need to work on this skill a little bit. So again, things like books such as Where's Wally can be really helpful. Some children find, again, it's use your child's interests and things that will be motivating for them. So, do they like doing treasure hunts? Can you play Hunt the Thingy? Choose something that is something that they like, that they're interested in, to hide, so they've got that motivation to get involved in the game. And again, if you can help them to organise their space so that they can find their things a bit better, that can be really helpful as well. If they've got separate drawers for separate things, you could always help them to colour code things using colour themes. All these sorts of things are really, really helpful. And for some children, you can use contrasting colour. So for example, the picture there where you've got a white plate on a red mat, it might just help them to focus on the activity and to focus on what they're doing. So the last sense that we're going to think about in this particular presentation is our sense of hearing. Okay, so here's a picture of the inner ear, and as you can see, the workings of the inner ear are very, very complex. Don't worry, we are not going to go into them in detail. But basically, at the end of our ear canals, we've got the outer bit of the ear that we can see, And at the end of the ear canal, we've got something called the eardrum, and that works by sound waves make it vibrate, and then the vibration gets turned into electrical signals, and these get sent to the brain. So when this system is working all very well and good, then we can work out what direction sound is coming from. We can tell the difference between volume, if something's loud, if something's quiet. We can tell differences in pitch, in tone, and the rhythm of sounds, and this all helps us to interpret what we're hearing. Something else that's really important when the system's working well, we're able to sort of just tune out background things and just focus on the things that are important, like somebody speaking to us, like something that we're watching on TV, and this helps us to stay focused on what we're doing.
So what sort of behaviours might we see from children who under or over respond to sound? So for children who under respond to sound, again, what we're going to notice a lot is they just don't seem to notice or seem to respond when people talk to them. So even if their name is called quite a lot of times, you might see no response at all. Again, they just maybe won't notice that you're even speaking to them unless you've got their attention in another way, by either getting them to look at you first or by tapping them, that sort of thing. So sometimes children do get the message, but it just takes a much longer time for them to process and make sense of these things. So if you find that children don't always respond to questions straight away, but they need quite a long time to process and think about it, and then they can tell you what their answer is, it might be that it just takes them that bit longer to make sense of the information that they've got through their ears. The other thing that you're going to notice is they're going to miss instructions or announcements at school. They might miss things like the bell and that sort of thing. And again, at home, they're not going to necessarily notice things like the doorbell going, text alerts, buzzers, that kind of thing. So it's generally they're just going to either not notice these things at all, or it's just going to take them a lot longer to tune in and to notice that these things are happening. And a key point here to remember as well is that when children under respond to sound, it's different from having hearing loss. So their ears are working normally. The problem is that the information either isn't being passed along or it's not being passed along quickly or efficiently enough. So it's not anything to do with hearing loss. And actually we'll find that a lot of parents do get their children's hearing tested when they under respond to sound, because they do present as if they have got a hearing loss. So what will we see for children who over respond to sound? And again, quite often children who over respond to sound have supersonic hearing, and they can hear tiny sounds or sounds from really far away that other people don't notice. So they either hear little things in the background, and they might be saying, oh, what's that sound that other people can't hear. They might notice sounds long before other people. So again, I've worked with children who will notice say there's an aeroplane coming, and it'll be quite a long time before you actually see it, and they've heard it from a really long way away. So when children are bothered by sound or notice a lot more sound, they can easily be woken up by sound at night, and this can be one of the things that can really affect their sleep. They can really struggle to ignore and tune out background noise, and this can make it really, really hard for them to concentrate, particularly in school. And something that we see a lot is children will just panic. So you might see panicking with everyday loud noises, and that might look either they might be putting their hands over their ears, covering their ears in some way, getting louder themselves, or just getting very stressed when they're exposed to loud noises.
So again, we've talked about difficulties that children might experience if they do over or under respond to noise. So let's think now about what we might be able to do that can be helpful for them. So for children who over respond to noise, something that can really help is just giving them some sense of control over the situation, because the problem with a lot of noise is other people's noise, and it's not something that children necessarily feel that they can control. So again, if they can have things such as either noise cancelling or noise reducing headphones. Certainly now you can buy earplugs that filter out excess sound but still allow you to listen to the things that you need to hear, and these might be useful for somebody in high school who's struggling a little bit, as long as they can tolerate the feeling of the earplugs. Some children might just like earmuffs, or some children might want to wear ear defenders. The only thing that I would say about ear defenders is that these can be really, really helpful for children who really struggle and get very anxious about noise, but it's really important that they're not used for any longer than is necessary. So they must be used when noise levels are high and children are anxious, but as soon as noise levels have dropped, please make sure they get taken off, because otherwise children just don't get exposed to just normal levels of noise, and we do sometimes find that children get more sensitive to sound over time if they wear ear defenders too much of the time. So that's something that's really important to remember. So the other thing as well, if you've got a noise that is predictable, so say for example, if there's going to be a bell at school or there's going to be a fire alarm test, because as we've said before, unpredictable sensation is sometimes worse than when we're expecting it. If the child is able to and they can actually activate it themselves, they sometimes find it a little bit easier to manage. So say if they're able to and happy to press the bell so they know it's coming, then that's something that can be really helpful for some children. But again, it doesn't work for everybody, so it's knowing your child. The other thing you can do as well is just gradually expose them to a noise. So say, for example, if they don't like the hoover, then maybe you just do a little bit of hoovering in a room that's far away from where they are with the door closed so that they can hear it, but it's not something that's really loud. And then gradually you would maybe open the door, you'd hoover a little bit closer to them so that they were being exposed to it, but at a rate that they could manage. The other things you might want to do are watch videos of things that they struggle with. So something that a lot of children really struggle with is fireworks because they are really loud, but maybe you can watch those on YouTube, have the sound turned down, gradually turn the sound up, and grade exposure to the noise of that in that way. So children who under-respond to sound, again, we maybe need to use some of their other senses to help them to notice and get the messages. So we might need to wave, we might need to tap them on the shoulder, depending on what they can cope with and whether they're okay with that before we try and talk to them and pass on any important information. So again, a lot of children might need us to speak slowly. And if they under-respond, they'll need a little bit longer to process and think about what you've said to them than somebody who doesn't under-respond to noise. So give them a bit longer to think about the answer to the question than somebody else, and that's usually really helpful. Some children, it's useful just to use just the key words. So you might just want to say their name and then what they need to do to get their coat or something like that. So you might just want to say Billy, coat. And sometimes that can be really helpful because there's less processing in that sentence. The other thing that you can do as well is maybe use some visual flashcards, or if your child knows a little bit of Makaton, you can use some of the signs there, and that can help as well just to reinforce that verbal message. This is the end of Talking Sense Part 2. When you are ready to do so, please watch Talking Sense Part 3. Thank you.